Well, I think we're now realizing we're dealing with a global contamination problem. I mean, these chemicals now are known to be contaminating the groundwater, surface waters, drinking water, soil, wildlife, vegetation, and people now all over the planet. In fact, we're even finding these chemicals falling in the rain above what some regulatory agencies consider appropriate safety guidelines. So this is truly a global problem of unprecedented scope and scale.
If you've listened to the Forever Chemicals podcast up until this point, or followed the global contamination issue over the last few decades, then you know the name Robert Bilott. Robert Bilott was dubbed as the lawyer who became DuPont's worst nightmare by the New York Times for his 19-year lawsuit exposing the scientific cover-ups of chemical companies using PFAS and effectively polluting the planet. In 1999, Robert Bilott was approached by a West Virginia farmer, Wilbur Tennant, regarding a mystery pollutant running off onto his farm, killing his cattle and making his family sick.
State of West Virginia issued EI DuPont Company a permit for them to run their contaminated wastewater down through 2 farms here out into this stream of water. This is 151 of these animals that's died on this farm up here since this stuff's been coming down through this water.
Flash forward 20 plus years, after winning his initial lawsuit for the Tennants against DuPont, and then representing 70,000 citizens in Parkersburg, West Virginia, Robert Bilott continues to forge a path ahead, protecting citizens in the United States and abroad from the continued PFAS pollution and contamination.
Yeah, we first started in on PFAS issues about 25 years ago, working with a farmer in West Virginia, trying to figure out what was happening to his cows. And that led to what has become, again, over 2 decades of litigation, starting off primarily against the makers of these chemicals, folks like 3M, DuPont, Chemours, those folks. And then also in later years, folks that have been making one product in particular where these chemicals were used in pretty significant quantities. That's aqueous film forming foam, or a type of firefighting foam used to combat petroleum fires. So over the last several decades in that litigation, where we were able to gather all of these internal documents, all of this internal information about what was known about the toxicity and danger of these chemicals, took a long time to get that information out to the scientific community, the regulatory community, lawmakers, and then in later years through things like films like Dark Waters or documentary, The Devil We Know, and now a newer documentary coming out, How to Poison a Planet. That has helped really increase the general public's awareness and demand that these things be addressed. So what we saw start off with cases really focused on the makers of these chemicals, like 3M up in Minnesota. We had, I think, the first case anywhere in the country against 3M back in 2005, or the DuPont plant in West Virginia. Now we are representing hundreds of cities, municipalities, water providers all over the United States that are addressing the fact that this stuff's in the public water now and has to be filtered out. And we're also representing over a dozen states through attorney general's offices and others as well. So we've now got this sort of new wave of litigation that has not only continued, but expanded. And through that litigation, we're trying to make sure that the victims here of the contamination aren't the ones stuck bearing the costs. We just had the US EPA announce just last week, for the first time ever, enforceable drinking water standards for a couple of these chemicals. And those standards are so low because of the health threat that these chemicals present, that we finally have recognition of, that's going to generate some really massive costs. And we want to make sure those costs aren't passed on to the taxpayers and the innocent victims here. So this litigation has been focused on really trying to make sure that the people who created this stuff and caused this problem are the ones who actually bear responsibility. And so far, we've been able to reach settlements for water providers totaling over $14 billion, some of the largest settlements in U.S. history for water providers. with 3M, DuPont. We were just able to announce a new settlement just Friday with Tyco for another $775 million. So we're working slowly to try to get those funds in place. We've actually even seen the federal government start allocating money towards this. But again, that's taxpayer dollars. So we want to try to make sure that the people who actually created the problem are paying. So that continues to this day.
And do you think then that litigation is one of the primary ways to kind of influence regulation or remediation efforts? Or do you think advocacy is also kind of like tied into that?
Well, I think it's a combination. Up to now, over the last several decades, really litigation has been about the only option because information was withheld for so long from our regulators and lawmakers about the risks of these chemicals. These went unregulated. So the only way people were able to get this stuff out of their water or to get the harm addressed was to go into the court system and try to get clean water or compensation for the damage caused. That's what's been going on for 25 years. So the fact that we finally have the federal EPA adopting enforceable standards is huge because we're finally moving these chemicals into the regulated realm. And states have moved forward to try to adopt standards and laws as well. Different states have done different things so far, different levels. We're seeing international efforts being undertaken as well. So hopefully, as the regulatory process and the laws start to catch up with the science here, we're going to see that people have more tools available to try to get relief.
Do you think that what took so long for the EPA to create a ruling like we saw last week, was that because it was the information and science was hidden for so long? Because you said you've been working on this for 20 plus years. So what was the holdup?
Yeah, it's a combination of things. It's one of the reasons I wrote the book Exposure, was to try to explain, how does this happen? How do we get into a situation like this in the United States in modern times where you've got these completely man-made chemicals, potentially thousands in the same class, the same family of chemicals that are incredibly toxic, persistent, bioaccumulative. Some of them we know now are carcinogenic. And we can't seem to get them regulated, or it's taking this long. And, part of the problem, as I mentioned earlier, was the fact that a lot of this information was covered up and withheld by the manufacturers for decades. But even as we finally found out what had happened here, it was an incredibly long, tedious process to get that story out and to get the regulators to pay attention to this. It took, frankly, getting things like films made, Hollywood movies made to really get attention centered on the fact that we had a massive public health threat that was going completely unrecognized. So, it was a combination of things, not only working through the court systems to try to get this information out, but, working with the regulators, trying to get the information to them, working with the scientific community to make sure they had access to the information, and working with the public and with the media to make sure they're able to translate what is, frankly, sometimes pretty complicated stuff, talking about chemicals that nobody can pronounce, nobody can see it, smell it, taste it, and finding ways to really make the public understand why this matters and why this is something we need to be addressing. It took us way too long to get to that point. But I think what we're seeing now is the result of the combination of all those activities finally pushing us over the goal line here of getting to the point where finally beginning to regulate and control these.
Yeah, and that was kind of the story in the United States, I guess. But I know in the podcast series that this is a bonus episode for, we talk a lot about the use of these chemicals in textiles. I interviewed several people from the European Union and other countries. And so I guess, to your knowledge, are there differences in terms of how we're regulating these things, litigation, and the public's understanding? Or is it kind of all following the same trajectory?
No, it's very different. A lot of this, of course, started in the United States. Even though we finally have become aware of the fact that it's the same chemicals that are being used in these products like textiles and foam and other things that are going all over the world and are being made in factories in different places, but it's the same chemicals. It's taken a long time for folks in these other countries to realize that the story that played out here in the US is the same story that they're now dealing with. These same exact chemicals are turning up in the water in Japan, in Australia, in Italy, in Germany, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, and France, and in the UK. And when the dark waters rolled out, for example, back in 2019, one of the things we did was we met with the European Union, with the UK Parliament, and with folks in Europe and with the UN to try to help them make sure that this story was told to folks overseas, that they understood this is the same chemicals that everybody's dealing with. And I think we're seeing that finally start to play out. But the problem is the laws are different in these other countries. They don't necessarily always have the ability to go into court like we do in the United States. The folks that are being injured overseas don't necessarily have the ability to get the kind of relief we did. In some instances, you have different laws that allow them to do very different things overseas. For example, in Belgium, we saw the government take steps to shut one of these factories down that was emitting these materials, something that's never happened here in the US, despite everything we've known to date. So unfortunately, it's the same chemicals, but very different legal systems. And in Europe, we are now seeing a different type of approach, something we tend to call the precautionary approach. Rather than wait for absolute proof that people actually have been made sick or been killed by this material. There's a preference to take action before the harm has actually happened. When you've got enough evidence to say there's a real risk here, that's when you begin to take action. And in the United States, we don't tend to do that. Our legal system and our regulatory system tends to require a lot more complex, longer process before we can take steps to begin regulating. And in Europe, we've seen even, announced global bans of the entire family of these chemicals. Concept that we're starting to see sort of trickle back into the United States. The most recent US EPA announcement of drinking water standards, we're seeing some of that. Instead of just focusing on one or two, we're looking at 6. So there's starting to be a movement to addressing the larger group, but it's a very slow process here in the US.
Yeah, it is really interesting how all of the different areas of the world are kind of addressing these issues. Are there any leaders in this space, or are we all kind of facing similar challenges?
Well, I think it definitely varies worldwide. You see different types of activities being undertaken in different places, different types of groups that have organized. In Italy, for example, there is a really well-organized group of local mothers who have been great advocates asking the government over there to take steps to address contamination for several 100,000 people in the Veneto region of Italy. And in other places, we see folks like Greenpeace or other organizations that are really leading sampling efforts, or actually media organizations that have collected resources to begin sampling to help collect the data that's missing. So I think you see different types of organizations coming forward in different places in the world.
Do you think following the EPA ruling last week, the drinking water regulations or limits, do you think we'll see kind of like a trickle down, like in addition to that, it'll just continue to build?
Well, US EPA itself has already announced that it is looking at additional potential regulations under different laws. For example, EPA has stated that it intends to regulate at least 2 of these chemicals, PFOA and PFOS, the C8s, the ones that have the 8 carbons, as potentially hazardous substances under the federal Superfund cleanup law. That would have lots of implications for a lot of folks across the country. And also, EPA has announced its intention to begin regulating these under a different federal law called RCRA, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. And that's the law that governs how you handle hazardous wastes, disposing of them or transporting them in the country. So again, I think we're seeing incremental steps toward fully pulling these chemicals into the regulatory system. And again, that's at the federal level. A lot of states have already started that process, not only adopting drinking water standards, but there are a couple states, I think New York, for example, that's already viewing some of these chemicals as hazardous under their cleanup laws. So I think that's going to continue, particularly given the science that's come in and has made fairly clear now. I think you're seeing pretty uniform scientific consensus that you're dealing with chemicals that really present a potential threat to human health and the environment. That's why you're seeing these acceptable levels really plummet to very, very low levels. Some of the lowest drinking water standards I think we've seen for any chemical. Lowest in the sense of how much is acceptable. For PFOA and PFOS, EPA is saying no more than 4 parts per trillion, with a maximum contaminant level goal, because those two are now viewed as carcinogens, of 0 in drinking water. So it gives you some idea of the concern about the toxicity of these materials.
Like you're saying, this is a global problem, and everyone around the world is facing this type of contamination, especially in their drinking water. So what changes need to happen in order to eliminate the use of PFAS, but then also influence remediation efforts and cleanups?
A lot of what we've seen so far, at least on the regulatory side here in the U.S., is focused on drinking water, which it should. We need to make sure that we address the most obvious source of direct exposure to people. That's drinking it in your water. So we've seen a lot of attention focused on setting these drinking water standards and coming up with technologies to remove it from drinking water. But what really hasn't happened yet is figuring out, what do we do about what's out there in the groundwater and will continue to be in the groundwater for decades to come, or that's in the soil that's filtering down into the groundwater, or that's in wildlife or in people. So we're seeing still a lot of activity trying to figure out, how do we address those other areas of the environment that we really haven't focused on. We see a lot of researchers, a lot of different universities and different firms that are trying to figure out how we do that. But it's going to be a really long, complicated process, I think.
Yeah, do you think there is a way to shift more of that burden, like you were saying earlier, onto the producers, the people actually causing harm, or the companies actually causing harm, versus the governments and citizens?
Well, I think that's what you're seeing right now. And a lot of this litigation is trying to do that, trying to make sure that this is more fairly allocated as between the victims and the perpetrators of the problem here. But it's a real conundrum. You've got massive contamination, but you have a fairly small group of companies. And, there's a real concern. You don't want to be stuck suddenly where those companies don't exist, or there's not enough funds available to do the necessary cleanup. So it's a real difficult problem from a policy perspective of, how do we address this fairly? This stuff obviously is used still to this day. These chemicals are in lots of different products, lots of different types of materials. So addressing the environmental and health threat is likely going to have economic impacts, but you have to balance that against the impacts to the environment and to public health. And that's the policy debate we see going on right now. And because of that tension, a lot of the legislation has sort of been held up and hasn't moved forward as quickly. But what has been moving forward is public awareness. Again, because of films and other activities that have been going on, that now that consumers have been made aware, hey, these chemicals are out there. They may be in these different types of products, things that are waterproof or stain resistant or grease proof. Consumers are speaking out and demanding that those materials, those chemicals, be taken out of those products. And so the market forces are starting to prompt change even before the laws change. We're seeing major international companies that are carpet makers or fast food wrapping companies or clothing retailers coming forward and voluntarily committing to take these chemicals out to respond to the market even before the laws have changed. So I think that we're going to continue to see that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. That market influence and push has been kind of interesting to follow. I work predominantly in the outdoor industry, and I felt like I saw that a lot in European brands, but many outdoor industry brands in the United States market were responding largely to the California regulation in textiles. So do you think that market push from not necessarily the chemical producers themselves, but the people or companies using those chemicals in their products is going to influence a larger shift?
I think it will. I think we're already seeing, as you mentioned, there are states, for example, like California or Minnesota or other folks that have come forward and started to regulate or to limit the use of these chemicals in certain types of products going forward, or in the next couple of years, these will be phased out. That has a huge impact. When a state like California starts to limit that, that's a big market. And so that has an impact on retailers worldwide. So I think as you see those laws start to come out, that is going to change the market. And frankly, we're actually seeing a lot of these companies that I characterize as customers, people that have maybe been buying some of these chemicals and oftentimes didn't even know it because they weren't told, or, it wasn't on their ingredients list, or it wasn't on the information they got was simply secret proprietary material. And now they're getting sued because somebody has tested their products and found PFAS, or they've found it in the wastewater coming out of their factory. And so I think that's creating market pressure, again, back up to the makers of these chemicals to get those out of the supply chain, because these companies don't want to get targeted in lawsuits like this. And a lot of times they had no idea. So I think that is really contributing to the market pressure to finally transition away from these materials.
We kind of started with the producer and then kind of like zooming in then. How can consumers, I guess, influence further regulation or even litigation that leads to regulation?
Yeah, the whole story of PFAS, I think, really highlights the power of individuals or communities to really prompt amazing change in this regard. Somebody like Mr. Tennant, the farmer in West Virginia, who was a single person standing up saying, wait a minute, what's going on here? And even when he was told, you've got a huge company on the other side, or the U.S. legal system doesn't let you do this, or the regulatory system doesn't regulate this, you can't do that. He stood up and said, no, that should change. And we're seeing that change. And we're seeing that now worldwide. As I mentioned, for example, the mothers in Italy that are standing up and saying, hey, we don't want this going on here either, or in Japan or in Okinawa, other places around the world, where individuals and consumers, now that they finally have gotten the information and the story has finally gotten out, they are standing up and their voices are being heard. And it's resulting in not only laws changing, regulations changing, but it's resulting in companies changing their behavior as well.
So when we're looking at the consumer, I know feedback that I have personally gotten from the podcast and other people learning about PFAS in the last few years is that it is a big, scary problem. It can kind of cause a lot of anxiety. They don't necessarily know how to handle the information. So what would your outlook be on the future of this PFAS problem? And do you have any advice to people listening?
It is a difficult problem. It's a big problem, but it is one we can tackle and one we are tackling. And we're seeing the positive results of that battle here. As I mentioned, the laws are changing, the products are changing, and it's up to consumers to look at the information that's out there now, that's starting to finally come out about what types of products have used these in the past. And frankly, it's not easy to find that information because, again, when these chemicals weren't in ingredients or they weren't on products, a lot of companies didn't even know they were using them. So it's not easy to just jump online and find, here's a comprehensive list of every place that these have been used. You have to kind of look for buzzwords that we now know are associated with these chemicals, like waterproof or stain resistant or nonstick or grease resistant. That should be sort of a red flag and to start looking a little closer and to reach out to companies, to understand whether they have information about whether these chemicals have been used, or to see which companies are committing not to use them. And that makes a difference. It really does. And I think, again, it starts with education and having access to this information. And there are some great groups out there that are trying to collect a lot of this data and make it available online. Folks like Environmental Working Group or Green Science Policy Institute, folks like that have tried to collect data and make it available online about what products are impacted and how you might try to avoid them or support the folks that are moving away from them.
If you want to learn more about what PFAS are, where they're found, the proven health effects, how you can limit your exposure, up-to-date news on PFAS, and how to get involved in PFAS regulatory efforts, visit toxicfreefuture.org, foodandwaterwatch.org, or pfascentral.org. Forever Chemicals is a Black-Footed Ferret production. All the source material for this episode can be found in the show notes or at theoutdoorminimalist.com/foreverchemicals. As an independent podcast, we rely on listener support as our primary avenue for funding. If you like this show and our other content, consider donating to our GoFundMe. The link is in the show notes.